the way it's meant to be brewed.
Weekdays on WUSF-FM 89.7. This is WUSF-TV Tampa St. Petersburg, your lifelong learning station.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Kalmbach Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Tracks Ahead introduces the Corwood facility in Chicago, Richard Kuhn of the Lionel Corporation, the Skyhomish Timber Railroad, and the Sacramento Railroad Museum.
Hello, I'm Chuck Zahner, and I'd like to personally welcome you to Tracks Ahead. You know the idea of piggyback railroading? Well, it's not really a new idea. It began better than 100 years ago when the nation's circuses decided to place those circus wagons on railroad flat cars for movement to the next community. At the Corwood facility on the Santa Fe Railroad in Chicago, giant overhead cranes straddle trains and can load and unload a trailer in a matter of minutes. Piggyback service and containerization is becoming a bigger portion yearly of the Santa Fe Railroad's bottom line.
The Corwood facility encompasses approximately 317 acres. Out of these 317 acres, 127 is predominantly dedicated to the TUFC operation. The TUFC operation here at Chicago got started back in 1964. From that period on till now, we've seen approximately a 15% increase per year. We are presently handling in the excess of 500,000 units per year, or about 45,000 units per month. That might seem very insignificant. However, there's only 43,500 minutes in a month, which comes down to about approximately 1.2 trailer per minute. Inasmuch as we're not one of the largest facilities in acreage here in the United States, we are probably one of the largest as far as volume. Our capacity presently is 292 89-foot flat cars. We average approximately 24 trains in and out of Chicago per day. From the beginning, I've seen various changes in the type of equipment we've been using on the railroad here. I've seen the standard cars that have been converted from tri-levels to rigid stanchion type equipment. Now we're into the articulated type of equipment. Santa Fe being one of the first into getting into the 10-packer, which we're capable of putting 10 45-foot trailers on one particular car. Now we've gone into the 5-pack type car, the spleen car, and the double stack. Of course, the reasons for these changes were the efficiencies, the lighter weight of the car, and of course, namely the loss of damage to the lading on the car.
When a trailer is brought into the Corwood facility, the first thing that happens to the trailer is it put into van inventory. It arrives at the checkpoint. We have a scale and a telephone. While the trailer pulls up on the scale, we in turn talk to the driver, get the vital information on the units.
Trailer number?
REAZ 681553.
Who do you drive for? Tractor number?
447.
Okay, is this from a customer?
Yeah.
Who is the shipper?
Trailer train.
Destination?
Tucson, Arizona.
Seal number?
5221.
Any hazardous?
No.
Okay, so that'd be lane 2 or 4.
Thank you.
After we take this information, we input it all into the computer, and a J1 or an inspection form is generated and sent down to a booth, whereas in turn a inspector will take that information and visually inspect that trailer. He inspects it for damage. He also inspects to make sure that every number is correct and matches up with what the driver gave us as the initial information. After the unit is checked and okayed for shipping, the driver in turn takes a copy of the driver's bill of lading and directs the driver to park the trailer by the last number in a designated row. When the trailer is billed in the computer, it'll automatically pop up in a page in the computer. We call it a RID in our computer, such as by destination, Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, Kansas City. We in turn follow a designated schedule every day for trains going out. On this schedule right now, we would be loading such as Dallas traffic. We will look up into the computer and either call up the traffic via the train number or via destination. Our westbound coordinators would then assign the various trailers to flat cars, taking in consideration the length, the weight, and the destination. Now, what we have to do here is we have to load ahead of time because we cannot wait until the cutoff time. And this is due to the fact that our cutoff and our departure times are sometime within an hour apart. We consequently, after the track is lined up in the computer, we give the list to our hostler drivers, or ramp drivers as we call them. And they in turn will go and find the trailer and bring it out to the flat car. The travel lift crews or overhead cranes will then come along and put the trailer onto the flat car. While we're doing this, in the meantime, the engines are being serviced at the roundhouse. They're being sanded and fueled and checked over for the departure of this various train. After the train is loaded completely, it is then pulled out of the piggyback tracks and is put onto a outbound departure track, whereas the power is brought out and attached to the train. The power and how much power is decided by how many cars we're going to load on a train. We will tell the train master on duty how many cars we expect to have on this train. He will in turn notify the system operations center, who will then decide on how many units are to be on a train via what train it is or the type of speed restriction it has on the train.
The future is just great here on the Santa Fe. I see approximately 14% per year. It's just growing with leaps and bounds. With the new type of equipment we've got here today, the double stacks, the articulated container cars, the 5-packer cars, the future is so bright. Realizing, moving via TOFC containerization and trailer, a customer no longer has to have a siding provided. His equipment can be brought right from trackside, immediately through his dockside. I'm looking forward to that future.
Jim Lorbecki of West Allis, Wisconsin's H.O. Gage Model Railroad features a logging railroad as it appeared in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the states of Washington and Oregon. This fascinating and well-detailed model railroad features a steam-operated sawmill complete with sound effects.
I became interested in modeling a logging railroad by reading. The more that I read on the subject, the more fascinated I became with the type of operations that were being done. There again, I tried to portray a little bit of it, tried to get some of it onto a layout that other people could see and enjoy as much as I am in what I am trying to model. On a tour of my layout, you will see basically the northwest section of the United States. You'll see part of Washington, you'll see a little bit of Oregon, maybe a little bit of California. You'll see a lot of imagination. You'll also see a lot of engines that are used in that particular type of logging industry. You'll see them running through hills. You'll see them on a cutback. You'll also see a town. Also, there will be a sawmill. There'll be a tie mill. Sometimes you will see some various types of riggings that were used on the layout. You'll see a skyhook. You'll see a crotch line. All terms that are logging terms, but yet had a specific purpose in what they were meant to do. There are basically three types of locomotives that are unique to logging railroading. They are the geared locomotives, which consists of your Shays, your Heislers, and your Climaxes. The reason this type of locomotives were used is the terrain that they had to negotiate to come out of the woods with the logs and bring them to the sawmills. A normal piston-driven engine could not handle this type of countryside. The sound system on my layout has two specific sounds. First one is a sawmill. The second one is a McGriffith loader. The sawmill is not a purchased sound. What it had entailed was about 5 of us in our garage, one working on a power handsaw, another one working on a table saw, another one shooting air out of a compressor, another person banging 2 pieces of metal together. All this composed into a cassette, which later turned out to be the interior sounds that is heard in the sawmill. The sound that is heard on the McGriffith loader was actually a cassette that was placed underneath a truck, which is called a cherry picker. As it was ran, it's a diesel engine, and as they used the cherry picker, it would shift RPMs in the engine. And being that this cassette player was placed on top of the axle of the truck, it gave a simulated effect as to the sounds that the McGriffith loader was using as it would shift gears in pulling the winches. The scenery on my model railroad is constructed what is called the hard shell method. First of all, I did have a wooden frame that was backed up by a layer of plaster, which molds were placed on top of the plaster, and all this was colored using acrylic paints. After this, various types of ground foam were used. A substance called permacene was used, which gave it a ground effect, and I did not have to worry very much about making sure that I had every single inch of the area covered with some type of paint or not. On top of that, we have various types of trees that we see in the layout. Most of these trees are handmade trees. Some trees are bought and some are from kits, but a lot of them are the type that can be purchased from a florist, for instance, like the Caspia trees. Another type is just the plain weeds that we find in our open fields. This was cut, they were airbrushed, and they were stuck in amongst the other trees and used as a filler so that you would have a lot of variety in it. You would also see a trestle bridge that was made out of mock chicken leg sticks. It is a very unique type of construction, and a lot of the construction on it just takes a lot of imagination. It's kind of hard not to really make scenery and not have it turn out right if you just let yourself go and kind of have fun doing it. What I feel about modeling a logging railroad is the fact that makes it fascinating to me is the fact it's no longer in existence. We don't see this type of operation as we tour from countryside to countryside. The only way we can find it is to look in a history book, in a magazine, or some type of other type of written material. This is also preserving a part of heritage for our generation, for people that have never seen it, and for people in generations to come.
In April of 1986, Detroit real estate developer and noted toy train collector Richard Kuhn purchased the Lionel Toy Train Corporation. Richard's interest in toy trains stems from his early childhood. In fact, he discovered his first Lionel train set in a garbage can on the way home from school. Today, the greater part of his toy train collection is Lionel.
When I was about 7 years old, I was walking home from school, and it happened to be trash day, and I beat the trashman to this particular trash barrel, and popping up out of the top was a Lionel train. So I took that home, cleaned it up, took it down the basement, set it up on the ping pong table, and believe it or not, it ran. I started collecting toy trains probably when I was about 9 or 10 years old is when I really got interested. Santa Claus brought me a toy train for Christmas, and there it was under the Christmas tree when I woke up Christmas morning. That really got me started, and then when I was probably, I'd say about 11 years old, 12 years old, I really wanted to get into toy trains, and that's when I started buying Lionel, or my parents did for me, and I was off and running. collecting toy trains is more than just a hobby. It's a great learning experience for people of all ages, and not only for men, but also for women. As I said before, when I was about 7 years old, I got my first train out of a trash barrel. I took it home and cleaned it, and it ran. That was a great learning experience for me. At the age of 7, it didn't run when I brought it home, and I took it apart. I learned a little bit about electricity. I learned how to take things apart and put them back together, and it did run. And all through my years of being involved in the model railroading, toy trains, the building of scenery, the building of buildings, the building of engines and train cars, it's a fantastic learning experience. On top of that, it is also a great experience in camaraderie among people from every single walk of life. People love to get together and play with a hobby such as model railroading. I think Lionel is an absolute tradition. It has been since 1900 when Joshua Lionel Cowan founded the company. He brought an excitement out of, well, really what he had. He was in the battery business, which later became the Ever-Ready Battery Company. And he had a static display of batteries in his show window. It didn't draw attention, so he put a battery on a car, a railroad car, and a piece of track, and that brought attention to it. His friends wanted trains, you know, something to take home and play with too. So that started the Lionel Train Company. And it's been a fascinating thing down through the years. It's a company that has survived. It is now, what, 89 years old since 1900. It's had its ups and its downs, its peaks and its valley, as has the model railroading hobby. It's gone up and down. It's very cyclical. It's a legend to model railroading, in my opinion. That's one thing that piqued my interest to buy the company. Great name, great product, great tradition. Within my collection, I really don't have a favorite piece. Each piece of train or building or accessory that is connected with model railroading has its own personality. It's like your own children. You'll love them all. Well, I love every piece of train I have. I receive all kinds of mail from varying people, from collectors, the true hobbyists of model railroading, from grandmothers, from mothers, and even from children. And some of the letters I receive from the youth of America, the children, are absolutely fascinating. They ask me questions, why don't we produce a particular kind of product? And it's amazing the knowledge that these young people have about not only toy trains, but the real world of railroad, which is really no longer here. I receive a lot of advice from collectors for new products. Again, my mailbag is full every week with their thoughts and ideas, and a lot of them are very, very good ideas. One of the interesting things is that the United States is basically divided into 4 regions, which would be the eastern seaboard, western, the Midwest, and the South. And the people, the collectors of each of these regions, all have different ideas as to what we should produce. One person will say, we'll produce this particular product, and the other will say, hey, don't do that product, but do a different kind of a product. And it's a hard thing to balance and know who really wants what type of product out there in the marketplace. The product development of our toy trains as it relates to either the collector or the traditional line, it's hard to say which we spend more attention with. Both are very, very important. The collector is here. He is the mainstay of our business. On the other hand, the traditional line, which is a very big part of our business, is also the youth of America, the future collector of America. So we, in fact, we're spending a lot of time on our traditional line, expanding it, putting more into the youth market to bring more people involved, more young people involved in toy training so they can grow up to be the collector. The future holds for Lionel Trains what the train hobby itself, what the future is for that hobby. First of all, I think the future for the model railroad hobby will be here. It'll outlive all the other, fads that come and go. It's been here for 89 years. I think it's going to be here another 89 years and years after that. There is something fascinating about model railroading. How does Lionel fit into that future? As far as I'm concerned, it's here to stay, and we're looking forward to it.
The California State Railroad Museum in Old Sacramento truly gives visitors the opportunity to experience the romance of the golden era of railroading. On display in the main building of 100,000 square feet are 21 lavishly restored locomotives and cars. This museum is definitely in a class by itself.
The California State Railroad Museum is an ambitious project of the California Department of Parks and Recreation. We got in the Railroad Museum business in 1969 when the Pacific Coast chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society began presenting their historic collection of steam locomotives and cars to the state of California. That organization had been assembling 100-year-old locomotives and cars since 1937. Frustrated with attempts to develop their own museum in the San Francisco Bay Area, they did a very magnanimous thing. They began presenting their collection to the state of California, and overnight, we were in the Railroad Museum business. The museum complex includes 6 phases. The first is the reconstructed Central Pacific Railroad passenger station, which opened in 1976. The Big 4 building, which includes reconstructions of the Huntington Hopkins hardware store, the Big 4 research library, the Museum of Railroad History, where we're standing now, 100,000 square feet, 21 restored locomotives and cars. The 4th phase, the Central Pacific Freight Depot, is completed just within the past 2 years. We operate live steam excursion train service from there. The 5th phase is the Walnut Grove branch line, some 17 miles of trackage, now in public ownership for operating live steam excursion train service. And then the final phase of the museum, now on the drawing boards, is the Museum of Railroad Technology, where we'll interpret the real nuts and bolts of railroading. The museum is this community's most popular tourist attraction. We host well over 500,000 visitors annually to the museum. By far the most popular phase of the museum to date is the 100,000 square foot Museum of Railroad History. It includes 21 restored locomotives and cars and 40 interpretive exhibits dealing with all aspects of railroading. As visitors enter the museum, they see a marvelous multimedia experience, a 12-minute orientation film. At the end of that film, the screen rises in front of the visitors, and they look out into a 10,000 square foot diorama set in the rugged Sierras in the 1860s. The doors open automatically, and the visitors are invited to step into that diorama. As they enter the Sierra scene, they notice the largest object in the scene, and that's the Governor Stanford, the very first steam locomotive of the Central Pacific Railroad, built in 1862 and shipped around the Horn. It was first assembled and operated just a few feet from where we're now standing. In the Sierra scene, you notice an engineer and surveyor's camp, a large tunnel from which the locomotive is emanating, and then it is heading east towards a meadow-style snow shed. You walk through the Sierra scene, you can't help but notice major exhibits, such as those honoring the tremendous contribution of the some 10,000 Chinese laborers who are the primary workforce on building the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Locomotive number 12, the Sonoma, was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia in 1876. The engine was built for the North Pacific coast, and it ran in Northern California. The locomotive epitomizes the real pride and craftsmanship of locomotive construction in the 1870s. We have accurately restored the locomotive back to its as-built appearance, complete with a solid walnut cab and a profusion of gold leaf ornamentation and striping that was so typical of passenger construction in the 1870s. The cab-forward locomotive is truly a one-of-a-kind engine. This locomotive was built towards the tail end of the steam era. Built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1944, the engine is over 125 feet long and weighs over 1 million pounds. Southern Pacific Railroad had 256 engines of this type. This was the last one built. It is the only one still in existence. Its unusual design has the cab up front so that the locomotive crews wouldn't be asphyxiated by smoke and gas from the stack as they pass through the long snow sheds and tunnels going over the Sierra. It is truly a one-of-a-kind locomotive. The Gold Coast was the private car of the late Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. It was built for the Central of Georgia Railway around the turn of the century. Its opulent interior is designed to accommodate 7 guests and a crew of 2. The crew has a galley, berth, 2 berths for them. The living accommodations include a fairly spacious 24-foot-long observation room, complete with a fireplace, a guest room, the master bedroom, complete with a stall shower, and then a formal dining room that will accommodate as many as 8. It's outfitted with delightful inlaid mahogany throughout and truly is representative of travel in the grand manner. It's a really very luxurious private car. Virginia and Truckee Railroad locomotive number 13, the Empire, was also built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1873. It was really the Chevrolet of locomotives, if you will. If you wrote the Baldwin Locomotive Works about 2 months later for $8,000, this was what you would get. It has a profusion of ornamentation of gold leaf and striping, and yet it's not as lavish as the Sonoma, which we saw earlier. This locomotive was designed as a freight hauler, and it hauled ore and lumber on the Virginia and Truckee Railroad from Reno to Carson City and the Comstock load. It last ran in 1931, and we've accurately restored the locomotive back to the way it looked when it was built in 1873.
The Railroad Museum Restoration Shop is in a building built in 1920 by the Southern Pacific as a steel foundry. We've leased it from the SP since 1976, and all the locomotives and cars you see on exhibit in the museum facilities are the product of this shop and the people who work here. We have 102 locomotives and cars in the collection, and only about 35 have received any kind of restoration or conservation treatment. A piece is selected for restoration based on its interpretive need or its operational value to us. There are factors such as cost and time that come into play. It comes into the shop and we go through a research program to determine what we have a hold of and attempt to build as close to a day-by-day chronology of its operation and service history, bring together the records which support its mechanical history, and then make a decision on how we're going to restore it. It's taken apart. We identify materials that are required, defects that need to be repaired, the skills, the talent that will have to be brought to bear on the project. A lot of work is done in this building with the machine shop, wood shop, blacksmith and welding shop. Other fabrication work occurs here. Parts are required from other locomotives, from historical groups, and from suppliers. We have to make an awful lot of the things that go into the piece. And then over time it is reassembled. We document the work so we have a complete record of the work that's performed. And at some point, the piece is done, and it leaves the shop and goes on exhibit in the museum facilities.
The final and most ambitious phase of the museum is yet to come, and that's the Museum of Railroad Technology. The state has just secured a 15-acre site about a mile south of the museum, and we envision visitors taking our live steam excursion train ride to this final component of the museum. There you would have an opportunity to observe restoration in process as we would open our restoration shops to the public. We found there's marvelous interest in seeing artisans accurately restoring 100-year-old locomotives and cars. In addition would be extensive interpretive exhibits on the real nuts and bolts of railroading, model railroads interpreting modern railroad operation, dissected diesels, dissected steam engines. And then the third component of the museum would be the reference collection, the rest of the museum, some 103 locomotives and cars.
Well, that's it, and I hope to see you next time on Tracks Ahead, when once again we'll take a look at that color, excitement, and history of America's railroads.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Kalmbach Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
It began 1,000,000 years ago, born from the Earth's savage fury, the Great Rift of Africa, a 4,000-mile stretch of scorching heat, freezing cold, and tropical forests. There are more kinds of animals here than anywhere in the world. In fact, here is where we first appeared. Follow our footprints in the valley as nature begins a 3-part safari to Africa's Great Rift.
Tonight at 7.
Next time on Nova, the deadly battlefield of chemical weapons. The use of poison gas was banned after World War I, but the superpowers continued to develop and stockpile new lethal gases. Today, international treaties demand disposal, while Iraq threatens to employ the poisoned winds of war. That's next time on Nova.
Tonight at 8. Share the feeling of accomplishment and pride that comes with mastering a craft the craft of basket weaving. Join Michigan basket weaver Sandy Atkinson as she instructs you through weaving principles and techniques using only natural materials. Learn to make a variety of baskets, whether you make it a hobby or turn it into a profession, on Country Basket Weaving, Monday mornings at 8:30, right here on WUSF-TV. A service of the University of South Florida, presenting information through educational, public affairs, and how-to programs.
Comprehensive film enactment of the birth of the Constitution.
Monday night at 8 on Channel 16. A service of the University of South Florida, presenting information through educational, public affairs, and how-to programming. WUSF-TV, Tampa, St. Petersburg.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Compaq Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Tracks Ahead introduces the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, the history of railroad artillery, Jim Kelly's N-Gauge Model Railroad, and the Lionel Corporation.
Hello, I'm Chuck Zahner, and I'd like to personally welcome you to Tracks Ahead. Since 1902, Lionel toy trains have been a part of the American way of life. Of all the toy train manufacturers, past and present, none is better known than Lionel Trains. The headquarters for Lionel Trains lies just beyond the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks, just north of Mount Clements, Michigan.
The future market for toy trains is really very positive. The demographics, that is, the growth of the population, is very strong in the age group from 5 to 14, and in fact for adults in the age group from 35 to 55. Even though the population is leveling out over the next 10 years, those segments of the population are growing, and those are the prime segments for both the kids for whom trains are bought and the fathers who buy them for the kids. I think there are several factors that contribute to the growth of toy trains. The first is the favorable demographics, the growing marketplace for the trains. Another factor has to do with the industry in which we compete, the larger industry, which is the toy industry. As a general rule, there has been a return to basic products throughout that industry, not just toy trains, but things like trucks and die-cast cars and a variety of other products that are simpler, more basic products rather than very exotic, computer-oriented, hot products, as they've been referred to. In addition, there is a move throughout our society toward more basic things, a return toward traditional values, a longing among people in this very complex society for simpler ways that they remember when they were kids. That also contributes to the positive growth of the train business. And then finally, there's been a change in the perceived value of toy trains. 5 or 10 years ago, a train set was a very expensive purchase for Christmas time for a kid. Today, with the growth of things like Nintendos and Cabbage Patch dolls and other very expensive toys, the relative value of that train set that has not grown as much, it certainly has had inflation like most products, but it hasn't grown relative to the rest of the industry. The relative value is much greater today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And that's also helped the growth of toy trains.
We decided on a new product in many ways. Some of the ways involve looking at train magazines. We subscribe to them all. We also do a lot of consumer testing and checking with our customers. We go to a lot of train meets throughout the year, and we listen to them. We take notes. And we actually really enjoy gathering all the notes at the end of each year. And we sit down and have a brainstorming session, and we decide, okay, these are the products we're going to do for the following year. I've got files and files of notes from people and letters and suggestions that they give us, and it's a lot of fun. The steps involved in the design process begin with a concept drawing. That drawing is then refined We give it to the engineering department. They, in turn, use a model maker to make this product for us so we can take a look at it three-dimensionally and make sure it's exactly what we want. At that point, we get it on our CAD/CAM system, and the part is drawn out, and it's designed where the window should go, how the stripe should go on the product. Let me show you a finished one here. This part here has been done in Amtrak markings, and this is now ready for production. This is the first piece, production sample. And once this is checked to make sure that everything works right and it's able to be done in this manner, we will then do it on the production line. The steps involved in the production process are many, and they begin in molding. Whether the product is die cast or whether it's plastic, it starts there. Once the product's molded, it's then taken to our paint department. Here it's painted, a lot of times with paint masks to give us varying colors, two-tone body styles. Then, once it's painted, the product is moved into our decorating department for hot stamp or pad printing. We put numbers on the product. We take the product and put road names on it. Many things are done there to enhance the product, to make it look like the real thing, like the real railroad product. Now, a lot of things are happening simultaneously. As this is going on in the decorating department, things are happening in other departments. Motors are being made, fields are being wound, armatures are being made, and commutators being put on them. Lock-ons are being made for the track that this product runs on. Also, in the winding department, things like coils for transformers are done there as well. You'll see the small parts. Wheels are pressed onto axles. Gears are made. Things of that nature. All these small parts that have to come together to make this product. Once all the parts are put together, all these little sub-assemblies, of which there are many, then the product is brought, all the sub-assemblies are brought out into a production line, and they're all attached. They're all put onto a chassis. Then this chassis, once that's assembled, is put onto the body itself. At that point, the product is ready to be packed into a box and shipped to our consumer.
The future of Lionel trains is very bright. We're very excited about the future of Lionel. The future really comes, or we will see it come, in three directions. The first direction is in our current businesses, the O-gauge, O27 business, S-gauge, large-scale businesses. As we continue to invest in new products, new designs, broaden those product lines, we'll see continued growth there. We're also investing in new technologies like RailScope, sound systems. All of that will help the growth of our basic businesses. Secondly, we'll be expanding over the ensuing years into other segments of the train business that we don't participate in today. I can't be specific, but there are some obvious areas that we're not in, like HO and a variety of other things. We are looking at all of those for potential growth in the future. And then finally, the third area, a little bit further down the line, would be growth beyond the toy train business into other related areas. Areas where the Lionel name may also have meaning for children or for their parents, like trucks or cars or road racing sets, radio control cars, things which the Lionel name brings a lot of advantage to from the consumer. The name has the quality value, the boy orientation, the mechanical orientation, and all of those things also are seen in those other product categories.
In the last several decades, many of our nation's railroads have merged. They have lost their identity. One road that hasn't lost its identity is the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. The road has many firsts to its credit, including the first railroad to enter Chicago in 1848. The Northwestern serves the agriculturally rich Midwest.
The Chicago and Northwestern was Chicago's first railroad, but it didn't come into the city because a city ordinance at the time forbade it from coming into the city, which then ended at the Chicago River. So we had to put our first station just across the river and therefore outside the city. That area is now a part of downtown Chicago. We received our first charter in 1836, but it wasn't until 1848 that we were able to purchase a second-hand steam locomotive and bring it by sailing ship from the east unloaded, and in October 1848, we ran our first train. That train helped us to build the line west to a point called Harlem, which is now Oak Park, the first suburb west of Chicago, and further on, spreading in three directions: directly west, directly northwest, and directly north. The name of our earliest predecessor railroad was the Galena and Chicago Union. By 1864, we had amalgamated another railroad called the Northwestern Railroad, which originated in Wisconsin, and we assumed that name as being more descriptive of our corporate purpose. Besides being the first railroad in Chicago, we were also the first to operate in the West by telegraph. That happened in 1856, about the time that we reached the Mississippi River. We were also the first railroad to operate sleeping cars west of Chicago in 1858. One of our conductors invented the idea of a cupola on top of the caboose, which was the little conning tower on top of the caboose, from which the conductor could look forward to see how the train was faring. We also developed something that isn't well known today, the railway post office car. That happened in 1864, and all through the Second World War, it was a very expeditious way to handle the mail. We operated the first diesel locomotive west of New York City in 1926 in one of our Chicago switching yards. We've had a number of famous passenger trains, probably none more famous than the 400, which covered the 400 miles between the Chicago and the Twin Cities in about 400 minutes at a mile a minute. Our Proviso freight yard, which is located 13 or 14 miles west of downtown Chicago, was, during the years of the Second World War, the largest freight classification yard in the country, and it still is one of the largest. We also innovated in the structure of our company in 1972 when we became the first Class 1 railroad ever to be owned by its own employees. Among the most important projects that we have launched in the past several years has been our coal line in Wyoming and Nebraska. It is probably the most profitable 200 miles of railroad track in the world. We haul low sulfur coal from the coal mines of Wyoming down to the Union Pacific's North Platte branch at South Morrill, Nebraska, and there they take it, give some of it back to us, and send some of it to other locations in the country.
The building of Global One was the fulfillment of a dream that really came out of necessity. The necessity was to move traffic, international traffic, faster and cheaper than we were doing it with piggyback. The end result is that we went to double stack as a concept. We took the container traffic, which was moving for several years on the Southern Pacific in this type of car, and brought it in through the West Coast ports to Chicago, and the system worked. It required a brand new yard which we call Global One. The yard itself cost about $23 million, but was part of a total package of about $40 million that we spent over a period of a year and a half to bring us from having one train a day up to 38 trains a week at the present time, and increasing probably up to 40 or 50 trains a week before this year is out. At Global One, we are handling up to 550 to 595,000 lifts. That's on and off, picking them up and laying them down a year. It is faster, it is cheaper, it is more consistent, it is damage-free, almost total damage-free. It makes the city of Chicago, Global One, a port. We are nothing more than an extension of the ports on the West Coast. We consider the yard as an extension of the ship. There's a turning basin for the trains. We bring the trains in, we unload them, we turn them back to the West Coast fully loaded, and we do this in a period of hours. I think one of the things that makes this thing work is the fact that we consider double stack and the way we operate it on our railroad to be like a baseball game. It's the customer's ball, bat, and glove. He owns the cars. He does the selling. He owns the containers that move on the train. We supply the diamond on which they play. The diamond is simply the railroad tracks on which they run, the engines that pull them, and the yards in which we do the transfer work. The project was a dream. It has become a success. It has been copied, recopied, and recopied, but there is no other railroad in the United States today that has an intermodal yard, a Global One, that only handles double-stack trains. We have found that you cannot mix conventional transportation and modern techniques and make them work. What comes next? Global 2. Why? The need has been fulfilled. It works. So we're going to build Global 2. Global 2 was started. It was started in March of this year. It'll be finished and operational in October and November of this year. Bluntly, Global 3 is a necessity that will come out of Global 2 simply because we're going toward domestic containerization, and people in the United States are getting smart enough to export traffic, and companies are getting into that business that were never there before.
Artillery guns placed on railway carriages began at the time of the Civil War, when a siege mortar was placed on an ordinary railroad flat car. Utilizing a 13-inch ball weighing 300 pounds, it had a range of 5 miles. By the end of World War II, it advanced to such a science that railway artillery was capable of accurately hitting a target 30 miles out.
Without a doubt, the most interesting aspect of military railroading was the concept of using railway cars with artillery pieces mounted on them. This concept got started during the American Civil War back in 1861. The first railway artillery was developed by both sides practically at the same time. This Confederate 32-pound rifled cannon was built in 1862. And as you can see, was mounted on a custom-made 7-axle chassis. The Dictator, built by the Northern forces, is actually a siege mortar used against the Confederates at Petersburg, Virginia during the campaign in 1864. 13-inch diameter balls weighing over 300 pounds could be fired 5 miles into enemy's fortifications. It could only fire straight forward, so as you see here, it was dismounted for firing. Later, in the Boer War, 1898 in South Africa, we see a photograph of this 6-inch gun taken off of a British cruiser and mounted on a reinforced flat car. You note the outriggers permit the gun to be fired in a full 360-degree arc. World War I was now the time to go into production. Experiments were finished. You saw factories such as the Snyder gun factory outside Paris, France, the largest producer of railway artillery during the war, having built over 200 carriages. Due to weapon size, the next major step was placing the rail car on its own turntable to provide full 360-degree arc of fire, as seen with this German 12-inch gun. The rounds of ammunition were brought to the gun's elevator for movement to the gun breech. Effective firing range of this piece was 50 miles. Big Bertha was the largest gun produced during the war. It was manufactured by the Germans, and in 1918 it fired over 300 rounds into Paris, France, killing over 1,000 people. World War II was the final chapter of railway artillery. The German gun Bruno, seen here, was a close relative of the Big Bertha. As the war progressed, rail guns got even bigger. The largest rail gun ever built was the Gustav, a 24-inch siege gun. The crew called it Dora out of affection. Note here the human figure in the foreground as compared to the carriage behind him. 20 axles per side, 80 wheels to distribute the huge 1,400-ton weight of this gun and its carriage. Unfortunately, few photos exist. Records in the gun ended up being destroyed at the end of the war. But you can note here the double tracks and the ammo cars behind the gun carriage. Notice also the power lifts toward the rear that brought the artillery rounds up to the breech of the gun. Oh, one thing I should mention. This gun had its own power. Two 1,000 horsepower diesel engines, which made everything work smooth. It took 4 trains of parts to put the gun together, including a crew of 4,200 men to construct, operate, maintain, and even provide security. Here we see a crane placing a 106-foot gun barrel in place. It took 3 weeks to construct the gun sight, but the gun car itself only took 72 hours to put together. Everything was prefabricated. Here we see the completed gun. Again, you can note the hoist on the back of the gun. The gun was used in 1942 to destroy Soviet forts at Sevastopol on the Black Sea. It fired 48 rounds over a 5-day period. Each round weighed 5 tons with a 30-mile range. Later, they found shells that had penetrated 21 feet of solid concrete and 35 inches of armor plate. Without a doubt, my favorite World War II gun, however, is the K5 gun, of which the German built 25 complete sets, complete with rail cars and crews. This is a model of the most famous one called Leopold by the Germans, and more commonly here in the United States known as Anzio Annie. In 1944, during the Anzio beach landing in Italy, this gun fired from a railway tunnel on the invading fleet. Hundreds of GIs were killed and several ships were damaged. It could fire a 560-pound shell 45 miles, or a special 300-pound rocket-assisted round 94 miles and accurately hit a target. It was captured and sent to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland for testing. Today, this railgun sits at the Aberdeen Military Vehicle Museum about 40 miles from Baltimore. Of the 500-some railway artillery pieces built this century, this is the last known railgun left in the world. Air power made them obsolete. Fortunately, I can announce that I've recently learned that the Navy depot in Washington, D.C. is in the process of putting together a new railway gun from parts and pieces that were left over from the types of equipment they used during World War I. Don't know about you, but I'm mighty excited about the prospect of going to see it.
Jim Kelly of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, models one of the true wonders of the railroad world, California's famous Tehachapi Loop, operated by both the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific Railroads. Jim's N-gauge model railroad features striking scenery as well as operation that closely follows the prototype.
I decided on this particular layout because back in 1979, I was between layouts. I'd finished a 3x8 layout, and I wanted to start on something new, something more ambitious. I took a business trip out to California, and while I was there, my good friend out there, Jim Fitzgerald, took me over one day to visit the Tehachapi Loop, which is a famous rail fan location in Southern California. And that day, I just fell in love with the loop, and I decided that that was it for me, that when I got back to Wisconsin, the first thing I was going to do was start planning a model railroad featuring the Tehachapi Loop and the Southern Pacific's Mojave subdivision. When it came time to plan this layout, the most important consideration was the loop itself. That was to be the star feature, and all the other elements were to be subordinate to it. So I wanted to have the loop sort of out in the middle of the room so that a person could walk around most of it and see it from all angles. Other elements were included, like the famous horseshoe curve at Caliente, but a good many other elements were left out for the sake of emphasizing the things I wanted to emphasize. So it was a matter of picking things that I wanted to include and emphasizing those and leaving other things out. The construction techniques here are pretty standard. The benchwork is the L girder type of benchwork that Lynn Westcott pioneered many years ago. The scenery, for the most part, is cardboard strips that are stapled to the benchwork and then covered with paper towels that are dipped in plaster. The rocks, for the most part, are plaster castings made in rubber molds. I use a product called Sculpt-A-Mold as the final covering on the ground. The grass and weeds and such are ground foam. The trees are Woodland Scenics kits. So there's nothing here that is unusual as far as technique goes. This is a double-deck layout. At least half the layout is double-deck because this is a mountain division. We start at the bottom and we go to the top. So one way to accomplish that is to have the two ends of the layout end up over the top of each other. And by double-decking, I was able to do that. The operation of the prototype railroad was a very important consideration when I was planning it. I wanted to reproduce as best I could in a scale model railroad the same thing that the Southern Pacific does day after day. This is a mountain division. The whole idea is to get the trains up and over the mountain and on their way. Generally, they have a lot of locomotives on the front, five or six more locomotives in the middle, and another one or two pushing. So if you'd like to see a show that features a lot of locomotives and power, then the Hatchby Loop's the place to go. It's also one of the few major stretches of railroad in the country that's used by two very important railroads, the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe. The Southern Pacific built the railroad back in the 1870s, but since 1899, the Santa Fe has also had running rights on it. So to me, it's very interesting to have two very colorful, very important railroads running together on the same layout. For me, modeling a particular prototype is rewarding because I'm able to do a better job. I haven't been a rail fan all my life. I don't know all that much about real railroading. So by imitating a particular prototype, I'm much less likely to make mistakes. I also think that there are a lot of little scenes and details on the railroad that I've copied from real life that are more interesting than would be the kinds of details that I would think up on my own if I were freelancing a railroad. N scale is a good choice, but not for all model railroaders, because younger model railroaders, say children under 10 or 11 years old, simply would have too much of a problem getting the trains onto the track. Also, relative to, say, HO scale, the equipment is more expensive item per item, and so for people on a small budget, it can be a problem. Older railroaders, and I'm getting to be one of them, have difficulty seeing this smaller scale, and maybe the hands start to get a little shaky. But I certainly want to accentuate the positive. It's a wonderful scale if you want to do what I want to do and have big, dynamic scenes, mountains, bridges, long trains, and really try to capture the feel of modern, high-speed, high-tech railroading in a mountain setting.
Well, that's it, and I hope to see you next time on Tracks Ahead, when once again we'll take a look at the color, excitement, and history of America's railroads.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Compaq Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Hello, I'm Roy Underhill. So you think you have an old house? Well, check out this baby. This was built in 1368 and is just one of the old German houses we're going to see when we visit the Franconian Open Air Museum. We're going to see German timber frame carpenters at work. We'll see how millers mill. We'll see wonderful things when we travel to Germany next time here in the Woodwright Shop. Please be with us.
Today at 4:30.
Hello, I'm John Davis, inviting you to join us for the next Motor Week 91. We'll bring you our test of the Chevrolet Capri station wagon and a quick look of the Mitsubishi Galant VR4. Craig Singhas will find out what it's like to run the Baja 1000. Lisa Barrow will look at in-car cameras. And Pat Goss will try to solve more viewer car problems. So be sure to join us for the next Motor Week 91.
Tomorrow at 6 on Channel 16.
10 years have passed since the Declaration of Independence, but America's hopes for a united country are dangerously threatened. Fragmented states continually bicker over currencies, trade, taxation. Now, an exciting new motion picture recreates that dramatic event. A More Perfect Union, the first comprehensive film enactment of the birth of the Constitution.
Monday night at 8 on Channel 16. A service of the University of South Florida, sharing our experience in education, entertainment, and public affairs to help build brighter futures. This is WUSF-TV, Tampa, St. Petersburg. Tomorrow night at 10 on Channel 16. A service of the University of South Florida, presenting information through educational, public affairs, and how-to programming. WUSF-TV, Tampa, St. Petersburg.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Compaq Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Tracks Ahead introduces the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum, Ernest Werther, woodcarver, the train barn, and the TMER&L profile.
Hello, I'm Chuck Zahner, and I'd like to personally welcome you to Tracks Ahead. The Mid-Continent Railroad Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin specializes in the operation of turn-of-the-century locomotives and passenger cars. The museum operates 4 miles of a former Chicago and Northwestern branch line, which was built to serve the mines in the area.
Mid-Continent Railway Museum, which has become one of North America's finest museums, began with an idea in the minds of 4 railroad enthusiasts in Milwaukee in 1959. As the collection grew, they looked for a place where they could spread the museum out and become more active. They located for a short time in Hillsboro, Wisconsin on the old Hillsboro and Northeastern, and bought this spur line of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in 1962 when it became available. They moved the collection here and began operating their rolling museum in 1963. And all of the development that has occurred since has been put here by the volunteers and the Friends of Mid-Continent Railway Museum. The line that we operate the Museum Railroad on was built in 1904 to serve a blossoming iron mine development situation that occurred in the LaRue, Wisconsin area. The line was extended from North Freedom south to LaRue to serve a series of iron mines that developed there in that period. This continued between 1904 up to 1917. They had difficulties getting the ore out of the ground. It became economically unfeasible to work the mines. They were shut down at the end of World War I, and then we began to develop a quarry at the foot of the Baraboo Range south of LaRue. The rail line was extended south, and for many, many years up until the early 1960s, this was the purpose of the railroad. It served the quartzite ore operation at the foot of the Baraboo Range. Our recreated turn-of-the-century steam train departs the 1894 historic CNNW depot, and CNNW stands for Chicago Northwestern Railway, leaves the yards at North Freedom after passing through the areas where the engine house, coach sheds, and other buildings are viewed, climbs out of the Baraboo River Valley. Once up at the top of the hill, it will proceed through the beautiful wooded areas and farmlands of Sauk County, down to LaRue, Wisconsin, which at one time, turn of the century, was a booming mining town, but which is now deserted. We will pause at the little depot there and give people a little background information on the history of the area and the history of the iron mines in the area. And we will then proceed south to the foot of the Baraboo Range. We'll make a brief stop there while people are allowed to disembark from the train, walk through the cab, look at the locomotive, watch it take water. They will then run the engine around the train, hook on, and bring you back through the same scenic areas to the depot at North Freedom. The entire trip will last about 50 minutes. The operating steam locomotives here at North Freedom encompass a number of builders, including famous names of the past like the Brooks Locomotive Works, American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Shea, and other famous names. Many of them now vanished completely from the scene. The wheel arrangements vary: 260s, 460s, 280s, 282s. Typical locomotives of the turn of the century are included in the operating collection and in the exhibit collections here at the museum. The era that's represented in the construction of these engines ranges from 1884 up until 1920. So you have a very broad cross-section of engines ranging in weight from 50 to 110 tons. Just exactly the sort of thing that people rode behind at the turn of the century. The operating passenger cars include coaches from the era of 1910 to 1920, built for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. They were used in passenger service until fairly recent years, until the 1960s on the East Coast for commuter work, intercity transportation. We have restored these and painted them and lettered them as they appeared in the era when they operated on the Lackawanna. We also have cars in the operating collection from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railway, from the Great Northern Railway. We have builders on our steel and wooden cars, including Jackson and Sharp, Pullman Car Works, Harlan and Hollingsworth, and other famous builders. So we have a very good representative collection, one of the finest in North America, representing all the major builders and all the major car configurations. Mid-Continent Railway Museum embarks on its annual battle with the elements in Wisconsin the third weekend of February, when it presents its renowned snow train operation, featuring rides on passenger trains, heated passenger coaches in the snow behind steam locomotives, snow fighting equipment, hot pot-belly stoves keeping the depot warm, all the elements of Wisconsin winter weather at the turn of the century. Looking down the path a few years into the long range area, we have on the drawing boards extensive continued development of the museum at North Freedom, including a roundhouse, turntable, 3 additional large coach shed, car shop buildings for display and storage purposes, further development of the exhibits, displays, and numerous things that will relate to our turn-of-the-century railroad environment as we grow.
The train barn in Portage, Michigan is the home of the Portage and Southern Model Railroad. On the second floor of a 100-year-old red cow barn is an enormous Lionel layout. Features on this model railroad include massive structures and bridges.
The train barn was started in 1973 in an old cow barn that my granddad had cattle in. The building is about 70 years old, and it's been in the family for over 100 years. In the upstairs of the barn, we have a model railroad. It's all Lionel. It's a 2,500 square foot layout with approximately 2,000 feet of track, 85 switches, and the main line is approximately 1,000 feet. It's all Gargraves track, and the total difference in height is about 44 inches from high to low. On our model railroad, we have mountain scenes, gorges, yards. We have 2 yards. One of them will hold probably 75 cars, and the other one will hold approximately 50 cars. We have a large engine facilities with 2 roundhouses and a diesel shed, large coaling tower. We also have an amusement park at one end of our layout in one of our cities. It's got a roller coaster and a N-gauge train that is used for an amusement train. We have a city at the other end which has a model of the Vicksburg Railroad Station in Vicksburg, Michigan. We also have several bridges, some worn truss bridges, large trestles, model of the Canyon Diablo Bridge, and we also have a model of our farm, which we live in. We feel the most spectacular scene is the model of the Royal Gorge and the Royal Gorge Bridge. The bridge was built in about 300 hours using brass angle, bolted and soldered together, plastruct base with about 50 pounds of steel in it for weight so it doesn't raise up at one end when an engine goes across the other end. Neoprene tubing for the cables, but there's a chain in the neoprene tubing so it won't stretch out of shape. Also, we have fish line that holds the bridge to the cables. We have on our layout approximately 35 locomotives, over 300 cars. Most of them are the MPC cars, which were made after 1970. We feel they roll a lot better than the older cars. And one train we pulled had 57 cars in it, pulled by one engine. I like operating line-out trains because they're larger. You can feel as though you're part of the layout. And in constructing buildings and bridges like that, the bridges are larger and you can put more detail in them. And with the big fingers, you can get them in there a lot easier to do the work on the bridges and buildings and so on. We started construction on the layout using 2x4s, 2x6s, 3/4-inch plywood. We used wood fiber plaster on 1/8-inch hardware cloth with very little support under it. And then after the plaster dries, you can take all the supports out. For trees, we used weeds that we got out of the field and just sprayed them with green paint. The painting was done by my wife. She used latex paint on almost everything. There's a little oil-based paint on the walls. But she did all the painting and then took art lessons after she had the painting done. The structures on the model railroad are some Plasticville, some Lionel buildings, and most of the rest are all scratch built out of balsa wood or plywood. One engine house in particular has stones on all the walls embedded in caulking compound. The ideas for the structures either came from model railroader or craftsman or my own ideas. For one instance is a model of our farm that we have in the one little area there. The others are just mostly buildings out of my own idea for the areas. We can run 2 trains on the layout at the present time on the same track. When we get all the wiring done, we'll be able to run 5 or 6 trains at a time with 2 engines operating in the yard and several on the main lines. Right now we just put a new control panel in and we've got to do all the rewiring on switches and so on like that. The advice I'd give to anyone starting in Lionel, HO, or N gauge would be not to start too large. Start with a small layout and add on. On our layout, we started with one area and added on 5 years later and then added on another 5 years. If you try to start too big, you'll become a slave to your layout and you'll burn yourself out before you even get a train running. So just take your time on it and don't start large. Future, the plans of the train barn. I would like to put an addition on a building, but I have 2 obstacles, the city and my wife. I can get around the city, but I don't think I can get around my wife. But right now, what we plan on doing is to put more buildings in and finish it off with more detail work and so on like that. And one thing I'd like to say is, remember, as long as you like it, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. That's all that matters.
The late Ernest Werther carved an amazing display of hand-carved wonders. Using only knives and files, he carved a history of the steam locomotive from 250 BC to present. 64 working models are on display at the family-owned museum in Dover, Ohio.
Dad was American-born right here in Dover, Ohio. Mother, father, brothers came over from Switzerland, but Papa was American-born. Father died 1888. leaving his wife with 5 kids, an old cow, 20 cents, no welfare in those good old days, no aid-dependent kids. She took in washings. The boys got odd jobs, but Pop, being the youngest, got the job of taking the cow along the road for free pasture. It's West German community. People seen him with that cow, they paid him to take theirs. He developed a herd. From the age of 5 to the age of 14, he herded cows. At the age of 5, he found a pocket knife, opened its stubborn, rusty blade with the use of his teeth, started to whittled signs, anything to get his hands on, and this led to a lifetime of carving. The workshop was built at the end of the lot, the same year as he built his home, 1912. It's a little 8 by 10 shed roof, slate roof, workshop. Uniqueness, many things. The trap door in the floor is one. That goes to a dugout below where he stored his walnut wood, which he got from a walnut tree in the creek bottoms. A dead walnut tree, he cut it up just like he'd split firewood and stored it down there. 64 times he lifted that trap door, jumped down there, selected materials, and made one of his famous carvings. The workbench, basically a lot of files. The handles are unique, those he made himself and designed to fit his hands. Butcher's meat saw hanging on the wall to cut the bone, then finally to cut ivory. The fireplace is where he tempered steel. The anvil he forged his knives out. He made many of his own tools, particularly his carving knife, which was a design and make of his own. He could not buy a knife that stayed sharp, couldn't buy one to fit the hands. Tempered the steel, made the knives to fit, created a work of art Smithsonian Institution appraised as priceless. The ivory carvings came about because Dad, when he learned to read, he only had a second-grade education, but he mastered the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. He got interested in ancient Egypt and found that the carvings in the tombs of Egypt made of ivory and ebony. 3,000 years old. They're as good the day they were put in those tombs. So this was something that he wanted to carve because everything he made to last forever. He didn't believe in America's built-in obsolescence. He started with bone. Mom made vegetable soup, he got the bone. Made his first 15 carvings, but once he could afford ivory, he replaced those bone parts. Now all the carvings you're going to see are ivory and walnut, ivory and ebony, and all ivory. Some of those ivories, for instance, Casey Jones. Hand on the throttle, eye on the rail, just as he was the night of his fatal crash, April 29th, 1900. The John Bull, the first passenger train to run in the United States, August of 1831. Incidentally, the original engine, that's in Smithsonian Institution. The passenger train, the fastest in the world, 1893, May the 12th, engine number 999, the Empire State Express, pulled a baggage car and 3 coaches, 112.5 miles an hour between Batavia and Buffalo, New York. Now, the carving is made from an 8-foot, 81-pound elephant tusk. Took him 1 year and 4 days to carve, including the base, which is a 74-pound log of ebony that looked like a 10-span stone arch bridge. Dad carved the history of steam engines because the steam engine fascinated him like it did every other American boy at that time. Started with Hero's engine, 250 years before Christ, where they used steam to open and close doors that housed an idol in a cathedral in Egypt, up to the largest steam engines in the world. His carvings are so perfect in detail, no engineer ever found any part missing in any way, shape, or form. The carvings are all in operation. They're moving. Therefore, he needed to oil them. And he knew if he oiled these carvings with an oil can, eventually he'd spot the wood and the ivory and mess things up. So by using arguto, it's a wood that grows in the swamps of South America for the bearings, has a natural oil in the wood, he wouldn't have to oil these carvings. And one of his carvings running now for 76 years has never been oiled and shows no signs of wear. When Dad carved an engine, he carved it in detail, every part. The drive wheels, 54 parts on a drive wheel, they're not turned on a lathe. The frameworks are made out of apple wood, plated with pearl. The bell, the whistle, and the bell rope, very fine and is carved on the curve. Often they broke. And that took a little cussing, so he never made bell ropes on Sunday. Knife making started back when Dad created his own carving knife to do the carving because he couldn't buy a knife that stayed sharp. Tempered to steel. Developed his own tempering methods. felt any knife would stay sharp, cutting ivory and hardwood would stay sharp, cutting food in the kitchen. He started making kitchen knives. He's better known locally as a knife maker than a carver for a long period of time. So as I grew up, he taught me the art of hand grinding and tempering. Now, making knives is a part of Dad's living all of his life. And it's still the family living. I have 4 sons, wife, and 2 daughters, which constitute the knife shop. We still make fine handmade kitchen knives. Dad's fascination with Lincoln started back when he was a kid, like with many other kids. He read everything that's ever been written on Lincoln. He'd quote Lincoln by the hour. And he carved Lincoln items all his life. The most famous carving of Lincoln was the Lincoln funeral train. That's an ivory and ebony carving showing the engine as it left Washington for Springfield, 14-day journey. The car was given to Lincoln at the second inaugural, but Lincoln never used it. He said he wouldn't ride in a car that was lined with armor. And the only time the train was ever used was on his deathbed as a funeral car. Dad started the carving on the 99th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, finished it on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. The museum is doing well. It's growing and will continue to grow. We have plans for additional buildings, better displays, more room for people. It's a family corporation designed to perpetuate itself. We're now going into a trust, which will guide this thing for future generations to come.
You know, one time Abraham Lincoln said that if you intend to go to work, start right where you are, for there is no better place. And then go straight ahead and never suspect that anybody's trying to hinder you. And any man can make a success of himself if you work that way. So that's where I got my philosophy from old Abraham Lincoln.
The Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, better known as the TM, was a superb interurban line. Its 5 routes totaled nearly 200 miles in length and had dining car service as well. This interurban operation began before the turn of the century and would last until 1951 under Speedrail control.
When remembering prestige traction railways in the Midwest, one easily comes to mind. That, of course, would be the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, or in its more shortened, more recognizable form, the TM. I've spent considerable time in researching this railway with primary interest in constructing scale models of its various types of equipment. For now, though, let's briefly recall this fascinating system. Line expansions from the Milwaukee area began with the Racine-Kenosha Division in 1897. Service to localities as originally designed included Cudahy, South Milwaukee, Racine County areas, and of course the cities of Racine and Kenosha. During this same early period, a second line extended to serve the Watertown, Wisconsin area. Localities served on this division would include the cities and towns of Waukesha, the company-operated amusement park, Waukesha Beach, the Delafield Lake area, Oconomowoc, and its western terminus, Watertown. A branch line off this division serviced the Hales Corners, St. Martin area, and Burlington. The remaining destination of this line, East Troy, currently remains as an operating company and traction system. The Sheboygan Line began in the early 1900s as the Milwaukee Northern Railway. This independent company operated until 1922, when it was merged and acquired by the TM. Major municipalities served by this division would include the northern Milwaukee-Ozaukee County area, Cedarburg, Fort Washington, and the city of Sheboygan. Service under TM Yarnell Company continued until the late 1930s and early 1940s. Order of line abandonment began at that time period with the Sheboygan Line, the Watertown, the Burlington, and the East Troy Division. Later in the 1940s, sections of the Fort Washington and Racine-Kenosha lines also ceased operation. Final service of the Waukesha Hills Corners line under the J. Mader Speed Railway continued through difficult years. Aged operating equipment from other interurban lines were acquired and used in an attempt to decrease operating costs. Through all its operating years, the TM remained a respected interurban railway. The equipment design was unique and distinctive, with passengers always reflecting their enjoyment in car comfort and safety. Train traction fans everywhere remember with fond recollection the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company.
It was the 1950 Labor Day weekend, and the National Convention of the National Model Railroaders Association was being held in Milwaukee, and part of the activities included 5 special trips to Hales Corners on speed rail. And the first 2 trips left Milwaukee's Public Service Building on time. I was on the 3rd trip. The train was piloted by J. Mader, who was president of Speed Rail. And we got to Hales Corners, we made our turn, we were on the way back. Meanwhile, trip number 4 was coming from downtown. That was a heavyweight train. Ours was a lightweight train. And we made our stop at Cleveland Avenue, and we flowed there rather, and we started northbound from there towards West Junction, and we got maybe a 1/3 of a mile up the right-of-way. We looked up, there was a slight grade there, and we saw the train coming towards us. This was a yellow train, trip number 4. We were going very slowly at that time because we were uphill. The other train was coming towards us, and he was going at a fairly high rate of speed. And at that point, we looked up. People were crowding towards the door after J. Mader took all emergency measures, putting the train, shutting off the power, putting the train into reverse, and putting the train into emergency braking. He got down the step. He turned to me and he said, "George, we've got to get out of here." And the next thing I remember is Jay rolling down the embankment, several other people. I looked up as I was in the stairwell, and I saw that the approaching train was almost on top of us. I stepped out the door, and at that moment there was an explosion of glass and wood and whatnot. And then I was rolling down the embankment. All I remember immediately following the accident was that it was incredibly quiet. There were no shouts or yells or anything. And that's all I remember of that time.
Following the Labor Day 1950 accident, the line entered receivership in November of 1950. A federal trustee, Bruno Bittker, was appointed to manage the assets of the line. A number of reorganization plans were submitted, but none offered the new capital that the trustee was seeking to reorganize the line. In a last-ditch effort to attract riders and possibly new capital, a last hope car 66 entered service in March of 1951. But unfortunately, it failed to attract the riders or capital that the line was looking for. Consequently, on June 30th, 1951, the line was abandoned and was sold to the Hyman Michael Scrap Company, and the following spring the line was dismantled.
Well, that's it, and I hope to see you next time on Tracks Ahead, when once again we'll take a look at the color, excitement, and history of America's railroads.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Kalmbach Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Next time in the Woodwright Shop, we're headed back to the Franconian Open Air Museum. We'll see more of the German timber carpenters at work. We'll learn about German log building or Blockbau and see how it changed as it traveled to America. We'll see the millwrights installing a new linseed oil pressing mill, all out of timber. So please be with me next time here in the Woodwright Shop.
Today at 4:30.
Hi folks, this is Bill Safe, and I'd like to invite you, the public television audience, to join me each week on board the Rod and Reel for another exciting fishing adventure. I'll take you to some neat places, and together we'll share the newest in tackle and some of the tricks to catch the big one. This is what we call trying to get you to take the bait. You might just get hooked on public television and Rod and Reel. They seem to go real good together.
Today at 5:30. Offering more
Story of Man's Capacity for Good, hosted by Bill Moyers.
Monday night at 9. A service of the University of South Florida, presenting information through educational, public affairs, and how-to programming. WUSF-TV, Tampa, St. Petersburg.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Kalmbach Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Tracks Ahead introduces Fallen Flag Railroads, the Milwaukee Model Railroad Engineers, the Railroaders Museum of Pennsylvania, and Roadside America.
Hello, I'm Chuck Zahner, and I'd like to welcome you to Tracks Ahead. Since World War II, many Class I railroads are no longer listed in the official guide. They have lost their identity and freedom through corporate merger, abandonment, or simply being a part of a bankruptcy bailout.
A Class I railroad is one that meets the minimum criteria set by the Association of American Railroads. In the 1940s, the level was $1 million, just $1 million. More than 130 railroads were on the list then. The minimum level has gone up over the years as the number of railroads has gone down. 5 years ago, the level was $50 million, and this now goes up automatically, adjusted to inflation. The current level is in the $80 to $90 million range. Today there are 18 Class I freight railroads comprising 15 systems, plus Amtrak, the national passenger line. There are also hundreds of short line, regional, and terminal company railroads. 15 years ago, our magazine did a series called Fallen Flags, featuring railroads that are no longer with us. The name came from the well-known flag or emblem that railroads show. A couple were even in the shape of flags. Large railroads have mostly been lost through merger with other companies, a movement that has been around as long as railroading has. But it accelerated after World War II and really picked up in the 1960s. A few big railroads have gone bankrupt and been sold or abandoned, but most of the fallen flags have been through mergers. Let's look at some examples of these fallen flags. Wabash was a railroad that served the heart of America, from Detroit and Chicago to St. Louis, Kansas City, and Omaha. It used a flag for its emblem and the slogan, "Follow the flag," as you can see on these diesels and cars. One of its hub cities was Decatur, Illinois, where passenger trains such as the Bluebird, Banner Blue, and Wabash Cannonball would combine. Wabash became part of the Norfolk and Western in 1964, and Norfolk and Western is now part of Norfolk Southern Corporation, having combined with Southern Railway in 1982. New York Central was the second biggest railroad in importance in the eastern part of the country to the Pennsylvania. It ran from New York City up the Hudson River to Albany, then west, also from Boston, to Chicago and St. Louis. It served all the industrial cities in the heart of industrial America: Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. This is a freight train at Toledo, Ohio, in 1960. New York Central's most famous passenger train was the 20th Century Limited between New York and Chicago, but it had others. This is the Twilight Limited between Detroit and Chicago, the premier train on that route. New York Central and its rival, the Pennsylvania, merged in 1968 to form Penn Central. Erie-Lackawanna was a relatively new railroad, created in 1960 from the merger of the Erie, which ran between New York and Chicago, and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, a parallel line from New York to Buffalo. Erie-Lackawanna originally took the black colors of the Erie, but soon replaced them with the maroon and gray of the Lackawanna. Before railroads were deregulated in 1980, they faced many obstacles in labor rules, and they had too much track for their regions. Penn Central went into bankruptcy in 1970, and that drew attention to the railroad problem nationally. Erie-Lackawanna went bankrupt in 1972. The end result of it all was Conrail, a consolidated rail corporation, a government-created railroad in 1976 made from Penn Central, Erie-Lackawanna, and 5 smaller lines. Conrail became a moneymaker and has now been spun off to the private sector. You and I can now own Conrail stock. Great Northern was a healthy railroad from Minneapolis-St. Paul to the West Coast at Seattle and Portland. With its parallel rival, the Northern Pacific, it was a half-owner in the Burlington route, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, which served the Midwest. This is a Burlington route freight train in 1961 at Savannah, Illinois, with Great Northern diesels. In the 1960s, Great Northern adopted a new color, big sky blue, but kept its famous Rocky the Mountain Goat symbol. This is the Western Star passenger train approaching Minneapolis in 1968. In 1970, after a long fight with the Interstate Commerce Commission to accomplish it, Great Northern, Northern Pacific, the Burlington, and a couple of smaller roads all combined to form Burlington Northern, still an industry giant today. Not all fallen flags are well known. This is the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, a personal favorite because my father served as its chief mechanical engineer from 1956 until retirement in 1968. He helped introduce the big black initials onto the orange diesels. DT&I, once owned by Henry Ford, was controlled by the Pennsylvania but operated separately. It ran south from Detroit to Ironton, 400 miles, connecting with all the main east-west railroads through Ohio. DT&I was purchased by Grand Trunk Western in 1981. Until now, all the pictures have been of diesel-powered trains. That is because the modern merger movement took place in the diesel era. Most railroads dieselized after World War II and on through the 1950s, although steam locomotives lasted on some roads longer than on others. We conclude our examples with this steam-powered freight train on the Baltimore and Ohio, taken in northern Ohio in 1957, just before B&O dieselized. The B&O was chartered as the nation's first railroad in 1830. It was merged with the Chesapeake in Ohio in 1963, and this became known as Chessie System in 1972. Later, Chessie was merged with the Seaboard System into today's CSX Corporation. Mergers reduced the number of railroads, but it made them stronger so they can compete better in the marketplace. With the federally financed highway system that came in after the war and afterward in the 50s, and the trucks increased, the merger movement has made railroads healthier today so they can better compete and survive.
Roadside America in Charlottesville, Pennsylvania has one of the largest miniature villages in America today. 8 O-gauge trains and 4 trolleys operate on 2,500 feet of track throughout this large display. And one of the great features of this village is that all the structures are scratch-built.
Roadside America is an indoor miniature village with trains. It covers approximately 8,000 square feet. And it shows a span of life from the modern back to the log cabin days. Roadside America was actually started when my father was just a very young boy. He used to go to the mountain in Reading, Mount Penn, and look over the city and with his brother and say, someday I will have a miniature village just like I see here from the mountain. And then at home, his mother left him always use the kitchen table and the stove to make these here little models which we have some pieces yet of when he was a small boy. And then after he got married, and he still made it as a hobby. It was only as a hobby. And he started in Reading with several small displays. He was at a fire company for 2 Christmas seasons. He was at another park where he had a larger display built. And then he went on till he come 4 miles west of Hamburg, where he actually opened more for the people to see, for the tourist trade. And it got to be, everybody said you should be in your own building and a larger building. And then he came up here in 1953 and opened here at Charlottesville. Roadside America is a step back in time. As you come in the building, you will see the zoo, which the children all like. Then you enter 1963 year modern village. There you see a school with all the bricks carved out, everything in the finest detail. Also, you see the town hall, which is another favorite of mine. Has a real clock in the roof. Then as you see all the buildings with everything carved, the windows, everything, the doors, everything in fine detail. Then you see the tavern as you go around with its hand-painted windows. There he derived the system of painting on glass, which at that time was unheard of. Then you see the church, which also has hand-painted windows, and everything of fine detail there also. Then you come around to the western town, which has a little harness shop in it that he copied his father's building. When he was born, he had a harness shop, and he copied that. Then he has a Henry Ford building, which has all the bricks carved out of that, also a little figure of Henry Ford carved, and the automobile that he made at that time. Then as you come around, you come into the log cabin days of 200 years in the past, where he would make a building and then hammer it down to look like it was deteriorating of 200 years ago. My father always had trains with his displays because he liked the trains. He has, in this one, approximately 8 trains, 4 trolleys. They are Lionel O gauge. Over 2,500 feet of track is in this display. And it is controlled by 2 100 amp transformers. Well, my father built this display with things that the ordinary person would throw away. My mother, she never threw a tin can away. She saved it because he used a tin out of that, which he made the little greenhouse. That was all made of a tin can and old picture frames, glass. And also, she would go to the auction houses where she was known throughout Reading, and everything that they couldn't sell, they would save for her, like the old boards, table boards, things like that. Anything that was unsaleable, unusable, he used to make this. That's why everything is built so strong. The scenery is constructed first. He built a wood-like platform. And on this wood platform, he put concrete, wire, cement, in which he painted and placed the trees to get the scenery. The streams are constructed of like a sheet metal with like a tar base, and then they have real water in them with fish. When many people come in to see Roadside America, they fail to look at the fine details. As he made his own molds, he poured from our kitchen stove, he poured these molds. Then he had to cut them out of all the loose metal to make them real fine. And that's what people don't look at, the spouting on the buildings and the doors and everything. He never just painted a window or a door. Everything was made by hand. He made the trolley cars and the trains years back, many years back. He made the trains. And now we use all the Lionel, the newer type. Roadside America has been such a part of my life from my early beginning. I hope it goes on, because people tell us all the time there is nothing like it. So I really hope with the family it just continues.
The Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, Pennsylvania has one of the largest collections of locomotives and cars on public display in America today. Two of the museum's steam engines operate regularly on the Strasburg Railroad. The museum is noted for their fine collection of Pennsylvania rolling stock. And if you're a Pennsylvania fan, you'll truly love this museum.
The Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania was established by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1963 to preserve and interpret the railroad history of the state of Pennsylvania. And the next task was to select a site for the museum, and of the communities considered, Strasburg was selected because it had an operating steam railroad next door. This gave visitors a chance not only to visit the museum, but also to take a ride aboard a steam train. The museum opened to the public in 1975 and has been in operation on a full-time basis since then. The museum complex consists of an orientation building which houses both permanent and changing exhibits. We have a 45,000 square foot rolling stock hall which displays 23 pieces of historic motive power and rolling stock. And outside in our yard area, which is open in the summer, we have another 41 historic pieces of motive power rolling stock, including such classics as the Pennsylvania Railroad K4, the locomotive number 460, known as the Lindbergh Special, and GG1 electric and DD1 electric locomotives, which were pioneers of the electrification movement. One of the more famous locomotives in the collection here at the museum is the number 7002, which was touted as the world's fastest locomotive at the turn of the century. This locomotive in 1905, on the inaugural run of the Pennsylvania Special, clocked a speed of 127 miles per hour. Now this speed record was made by two men with stopwatches, so it's likely that the record was spurious. Nonetheless, the Pennsylvania Railroad had publicized the speed record and it was never really challenged. So today we call the 7002 the world's fastest locomotive in the spirit of those early publicists for the Pennsylvania system. The locomotive 7002 was scrapped in 1934, and in the interest of history, the Pennsy selected a stand-in number 8063, which was backdated and today appears in the roll of the 7002. The 1223 is an operable locomotive of the 440 wheel arrangement. It was an American type engine that was constructed just after the turn of the century, and on the Pennsylvania Railroad it represents the ultimate development of this wheel arrangement. It was typically in passenger service at the turn of the century, and as the years passed, it was gradually bumped down to freight service. It did survive into the 1950s and was sent to Northumberland, Pennsylvania for preservation by the Pennsylvania Railroad at that time. And then in 1960, it was sent to the Strasburg Railroad, where it has been in tourist service to this day. 1187 is a 280 type locomotive. It was class H3 on the Pennsylvania system. This locomotive was built in 1888 at the Altoona shops of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it's significant because this was the first class to incorporate the bell pair firebox, which became a trademark of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This locomotive was one of the heaviest freight engines in its day, and it was in revenue service on the Pennsylvania till after the turn of the century. After it became obsolete, it was sold to a private concern and eventually ended up in a quarry near Reading, Pennsylvania. In 1939, when the Pennsylvania Railroad was looking for an old locomotive to represent the system at the World's Fair in New York, the 1187 was discovered in the quarry and sent to Altoona to be restored to its 1880s appearance. And it made its appearance at the fair and was then sent to Northumberland for preservation. The museum has an extensive collection of historic passenger cars spanning the years 1855 through the 1950s. The earliest car in the collection is the Cumberland Valley Combine car, which was built in 1855 in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Then we go to a whole string of 1880s and 90s wooden passenger cars built by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This includes baggage cars, a railway post office, coaches, and a combine. Then we jump into the heavyweight era, which includes a Lotus Club Pullman car, and a Western Maryland business car. The heavyweight era was characterized by cars that weighed in the neighborhood of 85 tons. Following this, we have the stainless steel lightweight cars that were introduced in the 1930s and were in service up through the middle part of the century. The museum has several units which could be considered commuter cars. First off, there are two electric multiple unit cars. These could be operated either singly or in trains. They were developed in the early 20th century to handle the onslaught of many commuters in the urban areas here in the East. The MP-54 car of the Pennsylvania Railroad was developed in the teens for service around Philadelphia. We have the first of those cars here in the collection. Then the other railroad represented is the Reading. We have the first Reading MU car developed in the early 30s for commuter service in and out of Philadelphia. Finally then, there is the rail diesel car, which was developed after the Second World War. This one served on the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and it operated with diesel electric power independent of the catenary that the electrics needed. The museum has a large collection of shifters or switchers. These include the A5, an 040 type of the Pennsylvania Railroad used in industrial service and on the waterfront. The B6, which is an 060 type, was the ultimate development in this type of switcher on the Pennsylvania Railroad. The 040 Reading Camelback is in the collection. This is only one of three to survive this type of locomotive, the Camelback type. Then the 1251 was a Reading saddle tank engine, the last steam locomotive in service on a Class I railroad. We have two fireless switchers. These were engines that had no firebox. They operated from superheated water, and when the throttle was opened, steam formed and drove the engine. They were used in mainly industrial plants, particularly where the danger of fire was acute. Finally, the B1 switcher is an electric switcher used around New York City in making up passenger trains. It was also a Pennsylvania Railroad engine. Railroading holds a tremendous fascination and interest for people for a number of reasons. First of all, I think railroading was such a tremendous industry that employing thousands of people that virtually every family in America had a couple of members that worked for the railroad. Secondly, railroading has played a tremendous role in our popular culture. Songs, films, and even model railroads have played a big role in American culture. I know that this museum, of the 60 facilities that the Commonwealth operates here in Pennsylvania, is the most popular.
One of the true treasures in Milwaukee land is the Milwaukee Model Railroad Engineers, or more commonly known as the Indian Head Lines. The club's large HO scale model railroad features a double-track main line with point-to-point operation and loops at each end to provide for continuous running.
The Milwaukee Model Railroad Engineers, also known as the Indian Head Lines, was formed in 1947 as a round-robin organization. And a round-robin meaning that the meetings were held in the basement of the various members of the club. After several years as a round-robin, the club got its first permanent location on the 5th floor of the Kallenbach building. Several years after this, Kallenbach needed the space, and so we had to move. Over the intervening years, we've had 4 or 5 different locations where we've been. We have moved here to our permanent location in the Walters building in 1978. Our layout is approximately 41 by 35 feet and contains about 600 feet of mainline track and 2,000 feet in track in total. We have about 30 members, ranging in age from 15 to 87, covering all the gamuts of education and occupations. The Milwaukee Model Railroad Engineers has issued 2 special series of cars. One, the first car that we issued, was in 1982 to mark the 35th anniversary of the club. And the second was in 1985 to mark the 50th anniversary of the NMRA. Both the cars were used also as fundraisers for the club, which is one way that most model railroad clubs raise money. The control system that the club uses is very similar to a real railroad, in that we have a dispatcher that is located remotely from the layout. He controls where the train can run by using what is called a permissive block system, by telling the engineer where he can run his train. The engineer controls his train absolutely. The dispatcher has no control over the way the train is run. The dispatcher has on his board a series of switches, electrical switches, that will control the various blocks on this layout. There are about 30 blocks, so he can control where these are individual locations. The system designed for the engineers is a home-built system that we developed for walk-around throttle control.
There are several advantages to belonging to a large club. They provide a satisfactory environment for multiple train operation. They provide members to do those activities that they know and or feel comfortable with. They provide an environment for learning new modeling skills. They allow for the socialization involving train-related activities. They provide for the sharing of previous and past experiences involving trains and or models. They also allow for longer train operation.
Here on the Indian Headlines, we have two traction systems. One, an interurban, like used to run from town to town, and the other, a heavy electric system, like the Milwaukee Road used in the mountains of Montana, Idaho, and Washington. The interurban system that we use will also carry freight. It is it's interesting to operate because most of the time we use the overhead to operate the trains and cars. And most people, when they come to visit the club, do not believe that the cars are really operating off the overhead until you pull the pole down and the train stops.
What are the future projects for Indian Headlines? Development of a centralized traffic control whereby the dispatcher can control the turnouts on the entire layout from the dispatcher's office. Track improvements for better operation. Scenic refinements as the need presents itself or a change of season. Development of a new portable module for our mall shows and other railroad shows. Development of a timetable for operation. And of course, a greater membership to provide growth in the organization as the hobby of model railroading grows itself.
Well, that's it. And I hope to see you next time on Tracks Ahead, when once again we'll take a look at the color, excitement, and history of America's railroads.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Kalmbach Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Hello, I'm Roy Underhill. Next time on the Woodwright Shop, we're going to see how to go from an old rotten garden gate like that one to a beautiful new garden gate like this one made out of cypress, pine, and red cedar. So please join me. I'll be waiting for you here by the garden gate next time in the Woodwright Shop.
Today at 4:30.
Deep within, the Earth sustains the hellish temperature of as much as 11,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The energy found in the Earth's interior is released in a variety of ways and has transformed the surface over billions of years. A mere 30 miles of hard rock separates the Earth's crust from the inferno that exists beneath the surface of our mild, temperate world. How can a planet covered by cool oceans be hot enough inside to melt the hardest rock? How can mountains grow and living creatures be turned to stone? Join us in a search for the heat within, next time on The Miracle Planet.
Tomorrow night at 10 on Channel 16.
During the Second World War, the tiny French village of Le Chambon sheltered over 5,000 Jews from the Nazis. Despite ever-present danger, the villagers did not turn away, nor did they betray a single Jew. The people of Le Chambon united together in a conspiracy of goodness, a conspiracy against evil. In Weapons of the Spirit, Pierre Sauvage, one of the Jews saved by the villagers, returns to chronicle the selflessness and the courage of Le Chambon. As one villager recounts, even the most ordinary people can do great things, given the opportunity. Weapons of the Spirit, the story of man's capacity for good, hosted by Bill Moyers.
Monday night at 9. This is WU on Nova. Tonight at 8. A service of the University of South Florida, presenting information through educational, public affairs, and how-to programming. WUSF-TV, Tampa, St. Petersburg.
Funding for Tracks Ahead is provided in part by the Compaq Publishing Company, publishers of classic toy trains, Trains, Model Railroader, and Trains Illustrated.
Tracks Ahead introduces Trolleyville, authors Tom McComas and James Toohey, Dick Schultz's H.O. Gage Model Railroad, and the Minnesota Commercial Railroad.
Hello, I'm Chuck Zahner, and I'd like to welcome you to Tracks Ahead. Trolleyville, USA began in 1954 when Gerald Brookins began collecting trolleys and interurbans to preserve an important part of America's heritage. Today, trolleys and interurbans operate on a 2.5-mile loop of track throughout a mobile home park.
Trolleyville is located in Olmsted Township, Ohio, approximately 250 acres of land within a mobile home park. We have about 35 interurbans and streetcars that run on about 1.5 miles of track. In 1954, the last streetcars ran in Cleveland. My grandfather and my grandmother went downtown. They had a parade to celebrate the last day of streetcar operation. Shortly after that, he thought that somebody should preserve a couple of streetcars. So he purchased 4 of them around 1954, brought them out to Olmsted Township here, where they sat for a few years in the field. His friends and neighbors out here thought that he was crazy, having these cars sitting out in the open. Around 1960, he purchased 2 streetcars from the Shaker Rapid line. Those cars were brought out here, and as things started to work